People called Ray Denton the bridge welder because he fixed what engineers said couldn't be fixed in the field: cracked load-bearing joints on interstate overpasses, fatigue fractures in suspension anchor plates, stress failures in expansion joints that the inspection report marked as requiring full replacement at a cost the county couldn't absorb. Ray fixed them with a truck, a portable rig, and a methodology he had developed over 22 years that no certification body had ever formally reviewed and no competitor had ever fully understood. 9 years ago, Ray sat in a climate-controlled conference room on the 14th floor of Halston Infrastructure Group's headquarters in Atlanta and told them the Crestfield Bridge expansion was going to kill people. They thanked him for his input, walked him to the elevator, and mailed his termination letter to his home address in Denton, Florida 3 days later. He drove back from Atlanta without stopping, parked in his driveway, and did not speak about it to anyone. Then on a Wednesday morning in late October, a white government fleet van and 2 dark blue Chevy Suburbans turned off Route 19 and pulled into the gravel lot beside his shop. And the man who stepped out of the lead vehicle wore a field jacket over a collared shirt and carried a manila envelope with a federal seal on the tab, and he walked toward Ray Denton's shop with the particular directness of someone who already knew the address by memory and had been thinking about this moment for longer than the drive. What they needed did not exist in any structural engineering lab in the country. It was sitting in a welding shop off a state highway in Central Florida, and the window was already closing. Dunellen woke up at its own pace on most mornings. The gas station on the corner of William Street opened at 5:30. The diner on Pine Avenue began pouring coffee at 6. And by 6:15, Ray Denton was already out back behind his shop, running a bead on a section of channel iron for a cattle gate that belonged to a rancher named Earl Foss who could not afford the quote from the fabrication yard in Ocala. The shop sat on 2 acres Ray had bought from a retired citrus farmer 13 years earlier. The building was a metal pole barn with a concrete floor, a rolling door wide enough for a flatbed truck, and a ventilation system Ray had designed himself out of salvaged industrial fans and corrugated duct. The smell inside was flux and hot steel and the particular dry heat of a grinder moving against iron at high speed. There were no employees, no apprentices, no front office. Just Ray, a radio tuned to a country station out of Gainesville, and an organization of tools along the back wall that looked chaotic to everyone who saw it and was in fact precise down to the inch. His customers were the ones the engineering firms passed on. Old highway bridges in rural counties with no budget for replacement, county road culverts with cracked headwalls that state inspectors had flagged but not prioritized, private industrial structures that had outlived their design life and could not be taken down without disrupting the operations around them. Ray never turned a job away because it was ugly or because the paperwork was thin. He looked at the structure, found where it was failing and why, and told the owner what he could do and what it would cost. The numbers were always lower than the owner had braced for. Dwayne Pickett, who ran a full structural engineering consultancy out of a converted house on the edge of town, had a habit of appearing at the county commission meetings where Ray's name sometimes came up in the context of emergency repair contracts and delivering some version of the same observation. "I just want the commission to understand," Dwayne would say, in a tone that managed to sound both reasonable and pointed, "that field welding on load-bearing infrastructure without a licensed engineer of record on the documentation is a liability exposure that this county should be thinking about very carefully." Ray heard about these comments secondhand and never responded to them. He had never responded to Dwayne Pickett directly and did not plan to begin. He had just shut down the rig on Earl Fossey's gate section and was moving the piece to the cooling rack when he heard vehicles on the gravel. Not one, not two. 3, arriving in sequence, decelerating in a way that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. He set down the section, pulled off his welding gloves, and walked around the side of the building. 2 blue Suburbans had parked at angles that closed the lot entrance without fully blocking it. The white fleet van had pulled straight to within 15 feet of the shop's rolling door. A man got out of the van's passenger side. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, gray at the temples with the unhurried posture of someone accustomed to delivering information that other people found uncomfortable. He held out a business card. Ray looked at it without taking it. The card read, "Warren Stills, Regional Director, Federal Highway Administration, Office of Infrastructure Safety and Emergency Response." "Mr. Denton," Warren Stills said, "I'd like to have a conversation with you about the Crestfield overpass." Ray looked past him at the Suburbans. "You brought a caravan for a conversation. I brought colleagues who are structural engineers," Warren said. "They're waiting in the vehicles because I asked them to wait." He did not add anything to that. He didn't need to. Ray crossed his arms. "I signed a non-disclosure agreement 9 years ago. Anything to do with Halston infrastructure is outside what I'll discuss. That agreement covers proprietary commercial methodology, Warren said. It carries a national security exception for situations involving imminent risk to public infrastructure. This is one of those situations. He held the manila envelope toward Ray and laid it on the hood of Ray's truck when Ray made no move to take it. I'm not here about Halston, I'm here about the Crestfield overpass on I-75, and I think you already know what's happening to it, because you described the exact failure mechanism 9 years before we started seeing it in the inspection data. Ray did not move. He looked at Warren's face for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he wants to read carefully before he reacts to it. Then he looked at the envelope. "Leave it there," Ray said. "I'll look at it when I'm ready." He walked to the far end of the shop, poured himself coffee from the machine on the shelf above the parts cabinet, and stood with his back to the lot for a full minute. When he turned around, Warren Stills was standing exactly where he had been left, not checking his phone, not moving toward the vehicles. Ray walked back to the truck and opened the envelope. The first page was a photographic inspection report. 16 images of the Crestfield Overpass's eastern expansion joint assembly taken at 30-day intervals over the past 8 months. Ray looked at the first photograph for about 5 seconds, then the second, then the third. By the fourth, he had stopped looking at the photographs and was looking at something else, something that was not on the page but that the photographs had brought back into a clarity he had spent 9 years not examining. He sat down on the tailgate without deciding to. The pattern in the photographs was not general deterioration, it was specific. It was localized to the exact weld geometry at the secondary bearing seat connection, in the exact orientation he had described in a report that had been accepted into the project archive and then, as far as he could tell, never opened again. The cracking was following the path he had projected. The timetable was slightly ahead of his worst-case model. He looked up from the report. How long? Warren did not pause. The county inspection crew found active propagation in 2 of the 4 primary weld zones at last month's assessment. The state DOT structural review team estimates 60 to 90 days before the eastern span reaches a load threshold that would require emergency closure. At current traffic volume, that's 42,000 vehicle crossings per day. Ray set the envelope on the truck hood. You can repair it. We can repair it, Warren said. We cannot repair it using conventional methods within the available window without closing the span, which the state is currently unwilling to do because there is no alternate route within 30 miles that can absorb the commercial truck traffic. The repair method would need to be performed under live load. No contractor in the current DOT system has the methodology for a live load weld repair on an expansion joint of this geometry. He paused. Your name appears in a 2016 internal report that was filed under a classification level most of our engineers don't have access to. I found it 6 weeks ago when I was trying to understand why the cracking pattern wasn't matching any of the failure models in our database. Ray looked at the gravel between his boots. Then he looked up. Let me finish what I'm working on, he said. Come back in 2 hours. 9 years earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 2016, Ray Denton had stood at the front of a project review meeting on the 14th floor of Halston Infrastructure Group's Atlanta headquarters and explained, in measured and specific terms, why the Crestfield Overpass expansion joint design was going to fail under sustained thermal cycling. He was 41 at the time, a senior field engineer with 17 years of experience across 43 bridge projects and a reputation among DOT inspectors in 5 southeastern states as the man you called when the textbook answer wasn't working. The room held 9 people. Bernard Coyle sat at the head of the table. Bernard was Halston's director of project engineering, a man whose professional manner had the practiced quality of someone who had learned to treat unwelcome information as a scheduling problem. To his left sat the project manager, a woman named Ingrid Foss, who was already holding a pen over a notepad and had not yet written anything. To the right sat the company's legal liaison, whose presence Ray had not anticipated. Ray's report was 31 pages. He had prepared it over 8 weeks, reviewing thermal expansion data from 12 comparable bridge projects in the southeast, and running the stress model at 3 different traffic load assumptions to bracket the failure range. The secondary bearing seat connection at the Crestfield expansion joint had been designed with a weld profile that met the AASHTO standard for static load, but did not account for the compounding effect of differential thermal expansion in a continuous steel deck system over annual temperature cycling. In northern Georgia's climate, where the bridge would see a seasonal temperature delta of up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that compounding effect was not incidental. It was cumulative and directional, meaning the cracking would propagate in a specific predictable path and would do so faster than standard inspection intervals would catch. Ray had asked for a redesign of the bearing seat weld geometry. The redesign would cost approximately $40,000 and 6 weeks of schedule. Bernard Coyle had looked at the report summary, exchanged a glance with Ingrid Foss, and then looked at Ray with an expression that Ray had come to recognize over 2 decades in the industry as the face a man makes when he has already decided something and is performing the courtesy of appearing to consider alternatives. The design was reviewed and approved by our internal structural team and by the state DOT's Plan Review Office, Bernard said. The weld specification meets code on every dimension. Ray said he was aware it met code. He said the code standard for that connection type had not been updated since 1998 and did not reflect the current research on cumulative thermal fatigue in continuous deck systems. Bernard said the project timeline did not have room for a redesign cycle at the current phase. Ray said the timeline did not matter if the bridge failed in year 11. There was silence. Ingrid Foss had written something on the notepad. Ray could not read it from where he stood. 3 weeks later, he received a letter from Halston's HR department citing a violation of the company's confidentiality policy related to unauthorized external communication of project technical data. The charge was specific enough to be documented and vague enough to be unanswerable. He had not communicated anything externally. He had given his report to his direct supervisor and to no one else. He signed the non-disclosure agreement because he had a mortgage on the Dunalon property and a daughter in her 2nd year of college. He drove back to Florida. He told himself he was moving forward. He knew on the nights when the knowing found him anyway, that what he was actually doing was not looking. Warren Stills had not come looking for Ray Denton. He had come looking for the source of a structural failure that none of his office's engineers could match to any model in their database. The Crestfield overpass had performed without incident for 7 years after construction was completed. In the 8th year, a routine inspection found hairline cracking at the eastern expansion joint. The inspector noted it, flagged it for monitoring, and the next inspection found the cracks had extended. By the 10th year, 2 of the 4 bearing seat weld zones were showing active propagation at a rate that did not match deterioration models for weather exposure or traffic loading in isolation. Warren had pulled the full inspection archive going back to construction and given it to his office's 2 senior structural analysts with no conclusion attached, asking them to identify the failure mechanism. They had worked it for 3 weeks and come back with a partial answer. The cracking pattern was consistent with cumulative thermal fatigue, but the geometry was specific in a way that suggested the initial weld profile was a contributing factor, not just the environmental exposure. Warren had then gone to the project's original design archive and worked through the engineering documents and found, filed under a miscellaneous project correspondence category that most file searches would skip, a 31-page technical report authored by a field engineer named Raymond J. Denton, dated February 3, 2016, predicting exactly the failure mode he was now watching develop in the inspection photographs. He had called Bernard Coyle that same morning because Bernard was currently serving as a senior infrastructure advisor to the state DAT under a consulting arrangement Halston had negotiated 4 years prior. Bernard had been unhesitating. Ray Denton was a skilled field welder who had some difficulty operating within the formal engineering review process, Bernard said. His report was reviewed internally and the concerns were assessed by credentialed structural engineers on the team. The project design was ultimately validated through the proper approval channels. Warren had noted that the report appeared technically precise. Bernard had noted that Ray had left the company under difficult circumstances and that his methodology had not been validated through peer review. Warren had thanked him for his time and ended the call. Then he had found Ray Denton's shop license in the state contractor database and looked up the address. The structural review his office had run that afternoon gave him an 80-day window at the outside before the eastern span reached a point where live-load repair would no longer be safely executable. He booked a rental van the next morning. Ray came back into the shop at midday. Warren was sitting on a metal stool near the workbench, reviewing something on a government-issue laptop. He stood when Ray came in. Ray looked at the report still lying on the truck hood and then looked at Warren. The cracking geometry, Ray said. It's not just thermal expansion differential. It's thermal differential combined with the specific weld bead orientation your team used on the bearing seat cap plate. The bead runs parallel to the primary stress axis. That's not wrong under static load, but under cyclic thermal movement it means every expansion cycle is applying a peel force directly along the fusion line. He said it the way a person says something they have been carrying in their head for 9 years and are finally permitted to set down. Your design team modeled the thermal stress correctly and the weld capacity correctly, separately. The 2 analyses were done by different groups, and the interaction wasn't captured in either model because neither group was asked to look at the combined loading condition. The connection doesn't fail from heat or from traffic. It fails because the thermal movement is applying a load type to the weld geometry that the weld was never designed to resist, and it applies that load thousands of times per year. Warren was already pulling inspection photographs on his laptop. He scrolled to a close-up of the cracked zone, the propagation axis, he said. It's exactly parallel to the bead orientation. It will be, Ray said. Every time. Bernard Coyle arrived in Dunellen the following morning. He drove himself in a rental car, which Warren noted later was unusual given that Bernard typically traveled with a driver when making official visits. He walked into Ray's shop at 9:15 and looked around with the careful expression of a man who was composing a sentence before he finished entering the room. Ray was at the workbench, not working on Earl Foss's gate, but sketching weld joint profiles on paper with a drafting pencil. Bernard said good morning. Ray acknowledged it. Bernard said he happened to be in the area and had wanted to touch base directly, which neither of them treated as a statement that required comment. He said the situation with the Crestfield Bridge was being handled through the proper state and federal channels, that his team was already developing a repair specification, and that he hoped Ray understood the importance of working within the established engineering review process, given the liability sensitivities of the project. Ray asked what repair specification he had in mind. Bernard said the current proposal involved a temporary load restriction on commercial vehicles combined with an accelerated replacement of the expansion joint assembly using a conventional full closure method, timeline to be determined based on contractor availability. Ray looked at him for a moment. Full closure on I-75 with no alternate truck route, he said. How many weeks? Bernard said the timeline was still being determined. Ray said, you should talk to Warren. Something moved through Bernard's expression, briefly and controlled. He left a few minutes later. As he walked to the rental car, he made a phone call. The only words audible to Ray, who was standing in the shop doorway, were Bernard's voice saying, "We need to get ahead of something." Warren arrived 90 minutes after Bernard left. He came in, set his laptop bag on the workbench, and told Ray that the FHWA's Emergency Response Office had formally authorized his technical participation in the repair assessment under a public safety exception to contractor licensing requirements. He also told Ray that Bernard had submitted a written communication to the FHWA regional administrator the previous evening recommending that Ray's involvement be limited pending legal review of the non-disclosure agreement's scope. How much time did that cost? Ray asked. About 14 hours, Warren said. The regional administrator reviewed the public safety exception statute and determined it was applicable. He looked at the sketches spread across the workbench. What is that? Ray laid out 4 sheets of paper covered edge to edge, in hand-drawn weld joint diagrams and stress notations. The repair methodology, he said. The complete one. I've been working it since 3 in the morning. It can be executed under live load with a 2-lane restriction, no full closure. Warren looked at the sheets for a long moment. He said, "You did this by hand." Ray said he didn't have the engineering software anymore. His license had lapsed 2 years after leaving Halston because the NDA had effectively made him unemployable in the industry. Warren picked up the satellite phone from his jacket pocket and made one call. He said 5 words, "Bring the team to Florida." Within 48 hours, a portion of Ray's shop had been converted into a functioning field engineering station. 2 workstations sat on a folding government table that Warren's logistics coordinator had driven down from Jacksonville in a government van. There was a secure data link running through equipment set up in the gravel lot. A structural engineer named Christine Yao, 32 years old, a doctorate from Georgia Tech, a previous posting with the Army Corps of Engineers, had been assigned to work with Ray on the repair methodology. She arrived on the second morning with 2 equipment cases and the precise calibrated openness of a person who had read the background file on the flight down and had several specific questions she was deciding how to ask. She had read Ray's 2016 report twice on the plane. She thought it was correct. She was working through what it meant that the report's author was operating out of a pole barn in Dunellen with an expired professional certification and motor oil worked into the creases of his knuckles. The first afternoon recalibrated her understanding in a way she would later describe as instructive without drama. Not a revelation. A series of moments in which Ray identified things in the inspection data that her analysis had not reached, and identified them not with the performance of expertise, but with the flat specificity of someone who had been thinking about a single structural problem for 9 years and had resolved every uncertainty about it a long time ago. On the second morning, Ray pointed to a secondary crack propagation path in one of the inspection photographs Christine's team in Atlanta had logged as a surface anomaly and set aside. He explained what it meant in 3 sentences and sketched the corrective weld sequence on the back of a parts invoice from the welding supply house in Ocala. Christine photographed it and sent it to the Atlanta team without comment. They responded 20 minutes later asking who had derived it. She typed, "The welder." She did not add anything and no one asked her to. The legal notice from Halston's general counsel arrived on the fourth day, addressed to the FHWA's Office of the Chief Counsel. The notice argued that Ray's participation in the Crestfield repair assessment constituted a breach of the non-disclosure agreement, specifically the provisions related to disclosure of project-specific engineering analysis derived from his work on the original Halston contract. The argument was technically constructed. It did not assert that Ray's analysis was wrong. It did not dispute the validity of the failure prediction. It argued that the repair methodology Ray was developing drew on analytical work that existed only because he had been part of the original Halston project, and that permitting him to continue amounted to uncompensated use of proprietary professional development. It was the kind of argument that sounded unreasonable to an engineer and plausible to an attorney who had not looked at the original project file. A portion of the FHWA's review panel found it worth a formal response. Warren received a call from the Deputy Administrator's office on a Thursday afternoon indicating that he might need to pause Ray's involvement pending legal review. Warren said he understood, ended the call, and drove to the shop. Ray was on the floor when Warren arrived, not under a vehicle but cross-legged on a section of clean concrete with 4 printed inspection reports spread in front of him and a yellow notepad on his knee. He did not look up when Warren came in. "The repair specification Halston's team submitted this morning won't work," he said. "They're proposing to fill the existing crack path with weld material and apply a cover plate over the bearing seat. That addresses the visible damage and not the load condition that caused it. The thermal movement will continue. The peel force will continue. The repair weld will begin propagating within 18 months, and the cover plate will mask the indication until the propagation reaches the base metal of the cap plate, which is a worse failure mode than what you currently have." He looked up. Whoever approved that proposal knew this. The geometry is not ambiguous. Warren sat down on the stool. "The Deputy Administrator's office may ask me to remove you from the assessment while the legal question is reviewed. Minimum timeline on that review would be 3 to 4 weeks. Ray looked at the inspection reports. "We have 80 days, he said, which is now closer to 70. And the load restriction that's currently in place on commercial trucks is inadequate because it's based on the static load model, not the thermal cycling model. Every week of delay is weeks of additional propagation." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Ray stood and walked to the steel cabinet along the back wall where he kept his personal files. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a USB drive and a printed document, the original version of his 2016 report, not the version submitted to Halston's internal review, but the draft he had saved to his personal drive the night before the review meeting. The document's file properties recorded the creation date, the version history, and the print date. Attached to the printed copy was a page Ray had added at some point in the intervening years, a log of communications from the Halston's project, printed from his personal email archive, including an email from Bernard Coyle's address requesting that Ray's report be revised to remove the specific weld geometry analysis from the executive summary before it was circulated to the state DOT's Plan Review Office. The email was dated 10 days before Ray received his termination letter. Ray gave the folder to Warren without a note. Then he said, "The non-disclosure agreement I signed covers project information. It does not cover documentation of instructions I was given to remove technical safety findings from a regulatory submission." The emergency technical review convened at 8 in the morning on a Monday, connecting Atlanta, Washington, the state DOT's Bridge Safety Office, 2 contractor engineering firms, and a welding shop in Dunallen, Florida over a secure video conference. Bernard Coyle joined from Atlanta, flanked by a Halston engineer and a legal representative positioned just outside his camera frame. He presented Halston's repair specification with prepared graphics and a project timeline showing completion in 28 days. He described Ray's analysis as the work of a non-licensed individual operating outside the formal engineering certification system and used the word unverified 6 times in 8 minutes. Warren listened without interrupting. When Bernard finished, Warren said, "Ray has something to walk through." Bernard said, "I'd like the record to note that any technical input from an uncredentialed." Warren said, "It's noted, Bernard." Ray had no presentation software. He had 5 sheets of hand-drawn diagrams which Christine had scanned and was now displaying from Atlanta. The first sheet was the combined thermal-mechanical load model, showing the peel force on the bearing seat weld under annual cycling conditions, with the force magnitude plotted against years of service. The second sheet was a side-by-side comparison of the Halston repair specification and Ray's, showing quantitatively why the Halston approach would fail to address the load condition and why Ray's would. The third through fifth sheets were the repair weld sequence, joint preparation geometry, bead orientation, sequence of passes, interpass temperature protocol, all specified to tolerances that Christine's team had independently verified against current structural welding code. Bernard said this has not gone through a peer review process. A voice from the state DOT's connection said, I ran the load model against our bridge management database. The force magnitudes are consistent with what we'd expect for this geometry and this climate zone. This is technically sound. A second voice from one of the contractor engineering firms said, the weld sequence on sheets 3 and 4, the bead orientation is the critical change. That's the right fix. I've been looking at that joint geometry for 2 days and I didn't see it until now. Bernard's video feed went dark 12 seconds after the second voice finished speaking. The connection did not drop. He had manually cut his camera. His audio remained active for another 15 seconds, during which there was the sound of papers being moved and a brief exchange with someone off-screen that the conference audio did not fully capture. Then his audio ended as well. Halston's legal representative remained on the call, said nothing for the remainder of the session, and disconnected without comment when Warren formally closed the review and initiated the process of submitting Ray's repair methodology for emergency technical certification under the FHWA's public safety provisions. Warren stayed on the video connection after everyone else had signed off. He looked at Ray through the laptop camera. You know this doesn't close cleanly, he said. Ray looked back at the screen. Things like this don't, he said. I knew that in Atlanta too. What happened to the bridge moved faster than the cautious end of the projection. On the morning of the 6th day after Warren's first visit to Dunellen, the state DOT's monitoring sensors at the Crestfield Eastern Span registered a measurable deflection event during a 40-minute window of peak morning commercial traffic. The deflection was within structural tolerance. It was also a deflection pattern that Ray's load model had predicted as the precursor to accelerated propagation in the third weld zone, the one that had not yet shown visible cracking in surface inspection. The state DOT's Bridge Safety Office issued an emergency load restriction within 4 hours that reduced the commercial truck limit to the level Ray had recommended 9 days earlier. The revised timeline for safe repair execution had contracted from 70 days to 41. The FHWA's legal review of the non-disclosure question, which had been expected to take 3 to 4 weeks, concluded in 36 hours after the email Ray had provided arrived in the chief counsel's office. The instruction to remove safety findings from a regulatory submission was not a protected proprietary communication. It was documentation of a potential regulatory violation. The NDA's applicability to Ray's participation in the repair assessment was set aside. Bernard's formal advisory relationship with the state DD was suspended pending review by the DE's Inspector General's office. The board authorized Ray's full participation under Warren's direct oversight. No one used the word vindication. No one used the word apology. They used the words public safety timeline and expedited certification, which in this situation carried the same meaning. Ray drove to Atlanta for the first time in 9 years. Warren had offered to send a government vehicle. Ray drove himself in his work truck, the same one he had driven home from the termination meeting in 2016, which he had kept maintained to a mechanical standard that had nothing to do with its age or appearance. The FHWA's regional engineering facility was different from the Halston building in ways Ray felt rather than cataloged. The vocabulary of the place was different. The pace was different. There was a quality to the attention people brought to the technical work that he recognized and had not been inside of for a long time. He was given a temporary contractor credential and a workstation. He did not use the workstation. He stood at the primary drafting table in the bridge repair coordination room, where Christine had pinned the full set of inspection photographs in chronological order along the wall, and he looked at the sequence from the beginning to the current week the way a person reads a letter they wrote a long time ago and finds that every word is still exactly right. The room held 19 people. Warren stood to his right. Christine stood to his left with a printed copy of the repair sequence as a backup reference. There was no performance in the room. There was the specific stillness of engineers who understood the exact significance of what was about to be committed to and had set aside everything that was not directly relevant to it. Ray looked at the repair sequence. He had written the joint preparation geometry and bead orientation specifications across 7 days, refining the interpass temperature protocol each morning as new monitoring data came in from the bridge sensors. The fundamental derivation had been correct on the first night in the shop. He had been carrying the problem the way a person carries a measurement they took years ago and have never had reason to doubt because they took it carefully. He initialed the repair authorization document with the deliberate steadiness of a person who has not rehearsed the moment because he has been certain about the work for a very long time. The repair crew went to the bridge on a Tuesday morning at 4:15 before the commercial traffic window. Ray was on site. He did not direct the crew. He stood at the edge of the work zone in a hard hat and safety vest and watched the repair welder execute the joint preparation sequence on the eastern bearing seat cap plate, and he watched with the specific quality of attention of someone who is checking work they have already done inside their own head 100 times. The first pass went down clean. The second pass, the critical bead orientation, went down at the prescribed angle parallel to the transverse stress axis rather than the longitudinal one. By 6:30, the repair was complete on the first bearing seat. The monitoring sensors read nominal. The crew moved to the second zone. By noon, all 4 bearing seats had been repaired. The monitoring sensors across the eastern span showed stable readings within normal operating range. The state DOT's bridge safety engineer signed the inspection report at 1:47 in the afternoon and lifted the commercial vehicle restriction at 2. Christine was standing next to Ray when the restriction was lifted. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said the second crew wanted to know who specified the bead angle. I told them it came from the field assessment. They asked who ran the field assessment. Ray watched a semi-truck clear the eastern span at highway speed, the first commercial vehicle to use the full bridge in 11 days. What did you tell them? He said. I told them the welder figured it out, Christine said. Ray watched another truck cross, then another. He walked back to his work truck and sat in the cab for a while with the door open and the afternoon Atlanta traffic moving on the overpass above the facility parking lot. He was not celebrating. He was doing something quieter and harder than that, which was adjusting to the fact of being right after 9 years of being treated as though he were not, and finding that the adjustment was not simple even when the outcome was exactly what he had known it would be. Warren came to the truck a few minutes later and leaned against the door frame. He did not say anything immediately. He was the kind of person who understood when words were adjacent to the thing but not the thing itself. Ray looked at the overpass. My father was a bridge painter, he said. Did every bridge on this stretch of I-75 back in the 80s. He used to say that a bridge doesn't care who built it. It either holds or it doesn't. He paused. He meant it about the bridge. I think it applies to a few other things. Warren said he thought that was probably right. They stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of people who have been through something and are only now, at the end of it, finding out what kind of thing it was. The formal investigation that followed was an audit conducted through the FHWA's standard post-incident review process for infrastructure safety events. It required a full reconstruction of the technical documentation and approval decisions made during the original Crestfield project. Every design document, every internal review record, every communication from the Halston project archive was subpoenaed. The email instructing Ray to remove the weld geometry analysis from the regulatory submission was Exhibit Number 4 in the audit file. The audit's findings were not made public. They produced a restricted administrative report that went to the FHWA's Office of Inspector General, the State DOT's Ethics Review Board, and the Department of Justice's Civil Division for assessment. The consequences arrived quietly and completely. Bernard Coyle resigned from his state DOT advisory position within 2 weeks of the audit's conclusion, citing personal reasons. Halston Infrastructure Group was removed from the federal contractor pre-qualification list for bridge and highway work in 7 southeastern states, not through a public debarment action, not through litigation, but through a procurement evaluation process that resulted in their applications being assessed and declined without elaboration. In the infrastructure contracting industry, the mechanism was understood by everyone who needed to understand it. Ray received a letter from Halston's current chief executive 3 weeks after the audit ended. It was 3 paragraphs. It did not contain the words, "I'm sorry." It said that the technical review decisions made in 2016 had not given appropriate weight to the concerns Ray had raised, and that the company recognized the significance of that oversight in retrospect. Ray read it at the workbench on a Thursday morning, the same workbench where he had sketched the repair geometry at 3 in the morning 8 weeks earlier. He put the letter in the metal filing cabinet in the back of the shop and did not respond. The restoration of Ray's professional engineering certification was processed through an expedited review by the state licensing board under a public interest provision. Warren submitted the supporting letter. The certification arrived in a standard white envelope with no accompanying note beyond the processing documentation. Ray set it on the workbench under his coffee thermos, where it sat for 2 days before he filed it in the cabinet next to the letter he had not answered. Warren called the evening the certification was processed, which he knew about because he had been tracking the status. "There's a position," Warren said. "Not with any state DO, not with any private contractor who's been involved in any of this. It's a direct staff appointment with FHWA's Office of Bridge Safety and Field Engineering. You'd be the lead technical consultant on live load repair methodology for the National Bridge Inventory Program's real position, not a gesture. Ray was quiet for a long time. "Let me go back to Dunellan first," he said. "There are things I need to close out." Warren said, "Close them out and then what?" Ray didn't answer immediately. After a moment, Warren asked whether he was thinking about keeping the shop open or winding it down. Another pause. Then Ray said something Warren would remember later as the first genuinely unguarded thing he had heard him say across the entire time they had worked together. He said he hadn't decided yet, but that Earl Fossey's gate was still sitting in the cooling rack unfinished, and he didn't like leaving work undone. Warren said that seemed like a reasonable place to start. Ray drove back to Dunellan on a Friday afternoon with the windows down, the country station out of Gainesville coming in clearly until he crossed the county line and it began to fade. The shop was exactly as he had left it. The rolling door was down. The sign above it had the same paint curling from the bottom edge it had always had. He unlocked the door, rolled it up, and stood in the opening for a moment while the afternoon light came in and the smell of flux and hot metal and warm concrete met him the way familiar things do when you have been away from them long enough to notice them again. Earl Fossey's gate section was in the cooling rack where he had left it. He put on his gloves, fired up the rig, and got back to work. Dwayne Pickett drifted past the front of the lot at around 5 o'clock, which he sometimes did on his way home. He slowed his car when he saw the 2 blue Suburbans that were still parked in the lot. Warren's logistics coordinator was coming the next morning to collect the equipment from inside. Dwayne slowed, looked at the vehicles, looked at the shop with the rolling door up and the rig running and the arc light visible from the road, and then drove on without stopping. Ray heard the car slow and heard it continue. He kept the arc going. He had a gate to finish and the light was still good. His phone was on the shelf above the parts cabinet. It buzzed once. He finished the pass, lifted his helmet, and checked the screen. "Warren," he answered. Warren confirmed the logistics pickup for the next morning and then gave him the date of the first team briefing in Washington. Then there was a pause that Ray recognized as the pause before something that had been sitting in a conversation for a while and was finally going to be said. "I looked up your shop on the satellite map before I flew down," Warren said. "I pulled it up 3 times. I kept having trouble reconciling the address with the report. I kept thinking I must have the wrong person." Ray set his helmet on the workbench and looked at the gate section in the rack, at the bead he had just laid, at the work he had been doing and would finish before the end of the day. "My father painted every bridge on this stretch of I-75, he said. "He used to tell me, a bridge doesn't care who you are. You either know how it works or you don't." He heard Warren start to say something and then stop. "I'll see you in Washington," Ray said. Warren said he'd see him then. The call ended. The shop was quiet. The rig was cooling down, and outside the Florida afternoon was going long and gold through the open rolling door. The light, the particular color it gets in October when the heat has finally started to break and the air is clear all the way to the tree line. And Ray Denton, engineer welder, the man they had called unqualified and then needed and then tried to silence again, picked up his tools and finished the job.